It was a chilly morning in a quiet Philadelphia suburb. In the kitchen of her pastel-painted two-story house with a garage, Christy Lawson was cracking eggs into a hot frying pan. Sunlight was just beginning to filter through the sheer curtains, touching a row of neatly arranged mugs on a shelf. Her husband, Dan Carlisle, was already sitting at the wooden kitchen table, scrolling through the news on his tablet. Their two sons, Caleb and Jake, were reluctantly descending the stairs, still rubbing their eyes. It seemed like another ordinary weekday in their family life had begun. "Mom, do we have any more cereal?" asked the youngest, Jake, yawning. He sat down at the table and turned the empty cereal box over in his hands. Christy put the pan of omelet on the stove and looked around. "Look in the cabinet on the left, honey. I think I bought some last week." Jake lazily opened the cupboard door. "Found it," he muttered, taking out a new pack. "Are you going grocery shopping today? We're running low on milk." "Yes, I'll go to the supermarket after lunch," the mother replied, ladling the omelet onto plates. "But first, breakfast. Caleb," she called toward the stairs, "hurry up or you'll be late for school." The eldest son, Caleb, appeared in the kitchen doorway, adjusting the strap of his backpack on his shoulder. He was 17 and already looked almost grown up, taller than his mother, with a serious expression on his face in the morning. "I'm here," he muttered sleepily and sat down at the table next to his brother. Dan looked up from his tablet and over his glasses at the kids. "Do you have anything important today? Tests, events?" he asked as usual. Caleb shook his head. "Just a normal day. Basketball practice after school." "I have brass band practice," Jake said, pouring himself some milk. He was 14 and in high school. Breakfast was a bustling affair. Christy kept getting up from the table to serve toast or refill the kids' juice. Dan kept checking his watch. He had to be in the office by 8. He worked as a project manager for an engineering firm and usually left before everyone else. After the front door slammed and her husband dropped off the boys at school on the way to work, there was silence. The house was suddenly empty. Only the ticking of the clock on the wall and the distant hum of a neighbor's lawn mower. Christy cleared the table, put the dishes in the dishwasher, and wiped crumbs off the countertop. These were simple, familiar tasks, and sometimes it seemed to her that her whole life consisted of such mundane morning chores. Once, many years ago, she had imagined everything differently. She sat down at the table where her family had been having breakfast just a minute ago and took a sip of cold coffee from her cup. She turned 40 last month, a beautiful round number that she had celebrated modestly with a family dinner at home, with cake and candles. Friends had given her bouquets of flowers, her husband had given her an expensive watch. Everything was wonderful, in the eyes of those around her. Nevertheless, on her birthday itself, Christy felt a nagging feeling. Was half of her life really already behind her? And all she had achieved was a cozy house in the suburbs, 2 wonderful children, and a strong marriage. Was that not enough? She knew that she should be grateful for her happiness, but for some reason her heart persistently whispered to her that something was missing. Once upon a time, before she got married, she had dreams and ambitions. Christy was an excellent student at school, especially loved literature and history, and even received a scholarship to a good college. But in her first year, she met Dan. Both were young, in love, and carefree. Then she became pregnant with Caleb and decided to leave school for the sake of a family. She did not regret it. Children became her joy, the meaning of life. But sometimes at night she imagined how life could have turned out if she had graduated from college then. Who would she have become? Maybe a writer or a teacher. She diligently drove away these thoughts as empty fantasies, but lately they returned more and more often. Christy stood up, feeling a sadness creeping up on her soul. Her hunched shoulders were slightly tired, although the day had only just begun. She decided to distract herself with some chores. That morning, she had planned to go to the supermarket for groceries and pick up some dry cleaning at the same time. Having gone upstairs, she quickly made the children's beds and aired out the bedrooms. Passing by the mirror in the hallway, she glanced at her reflection. A fair-haired woman of average height in a simple blue sweater and jeans. On her face, There were a few small wrinkles around her eyes, sunbeams, as Dan called them when he wanted to compliment her smile. She looked good for 40, but it wasn't about her looks. Afterwards, Christy went to the supermarket to buy groceries, as planned. The usual shopping route usually calmed her, but today her thoughts returned to the morning reflections on the life she had lived. In the grocery section, she ran into her neighbor, Sarah Miller, the mother of her classmate Jake. "Hi, Christina," Sarah greeted excitedly, moving bread into the cart where her baby daughter sat. "Haven't seen you in a while. How are you?" "Oh, everything's the same," Christy smiled, trying to appear cheerful. "The kids, the house, you know." Sarah nodded understandingly. I know. We're running around like squirrels in a wheel. By the way, have you heard the news? Our school friends, Cindy and Rob, moved to San Francisco. Rob got a job there, and Cindy, can you imagine, decided to finish her studies to become a doctor. At 42, what a girl, huh? Christy felt a slight prick. Cindy Brooks. She vaguely remembered her from high school. She had always dreamed of becoming a doctor, but had given up on her studies when she got married. And now she has decided. "Really?" was all she answered, trying to hide her sudden envy. A brave woman. "Yeah, I couldn't do that," snorted Sarah. "I don't have time for myself. It's good that I managed to go to the gym a couple of times a week, and that's a feat." They both laughed sadly. After saying goodbye, Christy continued her way between the shelves. Cindy's story stuck in her head. Decided to finish her studies. A brave woman, she repeated mentally. So, even at 40, you can start all over again. For some reason, this thought warmed her soul, although she immediately waved it off. "Cindy, there probably aren't any children, or they're all grown up already. And I." Christy thought about what she had heard all the way home. While she was unloading her groceries, her head was pounding. "But I could have done it too. I could have." She tried hard to drown out this inner voice with household chores, but it did not stop. At the end of the day, she allowed herself a moment of rest. She sat on the couch in the living room with a tablet in her hands. The social media feed was full of other people's news. One of her friends wrote about moving to San Francisco, another posted photos of her diploma defense at some university. Christy thoughtfully scrolled through the posts until her gaze caught an advertisement. "It's never too late to start over. A program for those over 30 who dream of getting an education. Stanford University, California. Applications are open." Christy's heart suddenly started beating faster. Stanford, California. She had heard of programs for adult students returning to school after a break, but it was all far away, not about her. Could she really dare? Christy clicked on the link and spent a few minutes researching the university's website. It turned out that there was a special scholarship program for people who had interrupted their education for various reasons and wanted to continue it years later. They had to write an essay about their life and motivation and apply online. She placed the tablet on her lap and closed her eyes. Thoughts raced through her head. What about my family? What will Dan say? Will I be able to leave everything and go? But another voice inside, bolder and younger, like the voice of that 18-year-old girl who once dreamed of conquering the world, whispered, "Why not? You're 40, but life doesn't end there. You've lived for others for many years. Maybe it's time to do something for yourself." Christy took a deep breath and looked back at the screen. Her finger trembled nervously over the Apply Now button. She hadn't made a final decision yet, but she could already feel it. This unexpected call of California had awakened something in her that she had forgotten: hope. The spring breeze fluttered the curtains of her office window as Christy held her breath and clicked on the inbox on her laptop. It had been a month since she had sent in her Stanford application, and now she had finally received a response. She clutched her cup of tea tightly in her hands, feeling her insides tremble with excitement. An email opened on the screen. "Dear Christina Lawson, we are pleased to announce that you have been accepted into the Stanford University Mature Student Program." When she reached this line, she gasped and covered her mouth with her hand. She had been accepted. The small possibility that she had hardly dared to count on had become a reality. Her heart began to pound. Christy didn't know whether to be happy or scared. Now the decision required concrete actions. She spent the rest of the day in a daze. Later that evening, when Dan returned from work, Christy was determined to break the news. She called her husband into the kitchen while her sons were upstairs doing their homework. Dan, we need to talk, she began, wiping her palms, damp with worry, on a towel. The husband, noticing the seriousness of her tone, put the phone down. Did something happen? Christy took a deep breath. Remember when we talked about my education? In California? Dan frowned, clearly trying to remember. He had been busy lately, and he seemed to have missed the conversation a month ago about some university. Basically, you mentioned something. What was it? I got accepted, she blurted out quickly, at Stanford, into that adult student program I told you about. The husband's face showed confusion. He took off his glasses. They accepted? To Stanford? Seriously? He looked genuinely surprised. Did you apply? Christy nodded, feeling a lump in her throat. Yes, I submitted the online application and essay last month. Sorry I didn't tell you right away. I didn't believe it would work out. Dan ran a hand through his hair, trying to process what he'd heard. So what now? You're going to go to school, straight to California. It's a one-year program, she explained quickly. Only 2 semesters. I got a scholarship, and they provide partial housing on campus. It's a rare thing, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. He looked at her carefully. What about us, the children? Are you seriously considering leaving us for a year? Christy felt a pang of guilt at his words, but tried to speak calmly. I'm not leaving you forever. I thought that you and the boys could cope without me for a while. It's for my education, for my future. I've been just a wife and a mother for so many years. It's very important for me to do this for myself. A frown appeared on Dan's forehead. For myself, I understand. Of course, I want you to develop, to be happy. But couldn't we find a program closer, in our state? Do we have to go 3,000 miles? Stanford is a world-class university, she said quietly. I didn't have those opportunities here, and I didn't find a program like that. Plus, I've always wanted to live in California, you know. I wanted to, Dan shook his head. Christy, what about the kids? Caleb is a senior, he needs support. Jake is a teenager, he's going through puberty. Have you thought about what we'll tell them? She looked down. Of course, she had been thinking about it every day since she applied. Let's tell the truth. That mom got a chance to fulfill her long-time dream and that you will all try to support her. The husband cursed quietly under his breath, holding back his irritation. Support, easy to say. But what if they don't want to? Jake will definitely be upset. He'll get used to it, she said uncertainly. It won't be long, just a year. I'll fly in for the holidays. We'll be able to call each other every day. Dan pushed his chair back and paced the kitchen. I don't know, Chris. It's too sudden. He stopped in front of his wife. Are you sure it's worth it? Our marriage, our family. Not everyone can handle this kind of ordeal. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she shook her head. Please don't ask that question. I'm not abandoning my family. I want to come back later. It's just, I feel like I have to try. If not now, then never. They were silent for a while. Dan pinched the bridge of his nose, then exhaled. Let's at least discuss this with the kids together. Let's see their reaction. Christy nodded in agreement, wiping her eyes. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but inside, a warm flame of joy still burned. Her dream was starting to come true. The next day at dinner, Christy and Dan exchanged glances as they prepared to break the news to their sons. Caleb was excitedly talking about the workout, and Jake was typing something quickly on his phone under the table. Finally, Dan cleared his throat, getting their attention. Guys, listen. Mom has an important announcement for you. Caleb looked up from his plate, and Jake looked up too. Christy surreptitiously shook her husband's hand under the table, then said in as even a voice as she could, "I was accepted to study at a university in California. I'm going to go study there for a while." There was a pause. The boys clearly did not immediately understand the meaning of the words. Caleb was the first to react. "To California? To study?" he asked, looking from his mother to his father. "What do you mean? You're going there alone?" "It turns out that way," she answered softly. "The program lasts 1 academic year. I will come for the holidays, and of course, we will call each other. This is very important to me, and I hope for your support." Jake's brows furrowed, and he frowned. "So you're not going to be home for a whole year?" "Well, yes, the school year," repeated Christy, trying to smile at her son. "You know, I've wanted to get a higher education for a long time. Remember, I went to classes in the city? Well, I'll be able to study at one of the best universities in the world." "What about us?" Jake said stubbornly, lowering his voice. "Who's going to take Caleb and me to school? Who's going to cook normal food? Dad works late." Dan intervened. "I'll try to work out a schedule. And Grandma promised to help out when needed. Remember, she lives half an hour away from us." "I'm going to miss you so much," Christy said, looking from one son to the other. "But now that we have video communication, we can talk face to face through a screen every day." "It's not the same," Jake muttered. He was clearly upset and trying to hide it with a gruff tone. "Why would you even want to do that, Mom? You're fine." Christy thought about how to explain. "You see, sometimes people want to make their dreams come true, even if they're adults. I've always dreamed of going to a good university, learning something new, getting a degree. It's important to me personally. But you too, Caleb, Jake, you'll always come first for me." "But if we came first, you wouldn't be leaving," Jake said quietly, pushing his plate away. He stood up from the table. "I'm done." "Jake," the father called, but his son had already left the kitchen, stomping loudly up the stairs. In the silence that followed, Caleb put his elbows on the table and rubbed his face tiredly with his hands. "Okay, Mom, I understand, I guess. It's important to you. It's just, this is graduation year, starting college. It'll be weird not having you around." Christy felt her throat tighten at the words. "I know, honey, but I'll try to make it to graduation, I promise. You're planning on going to Penn State, right? It's not far, and I'll be back just in time for you to enroll." Caleb nodded, though he looked dejected. "Yeah, okay. Let's just hope everything turns out okay here." The rest of the dinner passed in silence. Later that evening, Christy knocked on Jake's door. He was lying on his bed with his headphones on, staring at the ceiling. When he heard his mother, he took his headphones off, but didn't look at her. Christy sat on the edge of his bed. "Honey, can we talk? You know I don't want to hurt you." "But you do," the son muttered, still not looking at her. "You're abandoning us for some kind of studies." Her lips trembled. "I'm not quitting. I really want you to understand that. I'll be back. It's only a few months of studying." Jake looked at her reproachfully. "You were always home, always, and now you won't be. Like you're tired of us, or we're boring you." "No, no," she shook her head, breaking into a whisper. "It's not about you. It's just that I've really been dreaming about this for a long time. I hope you can forgive me for it turning out this way." The boy said nothing, just turned away, staring at the wall. Christy patted his back, realizing that it was best to let him digest the news now. Early on the morning of their departure, Dan loaded his wife's suitcases into the trunk of the family SUV. Caleb helped, silently shifting the bags, and Jake stood on the porch, his head down. Christy closed the door to the house, taking one last look at the cozy living room where she had spent so many happy hours with her family. Her heart sank, but she forced a smile. On the way to the airport, no one spoke much. The radio played softly, and the familiar suburban streets stretched out the window. Christy tried to remember every little thing. The mailboxes along the road, the cafe on the corner where they had breakfast with the whole family on weekends, the school stadium they passed by. Now she would not see all this any time soon. At the airport, the family reached the security checkpoint, beyond which those seeing them off were not allowed to enter. It was time to say goodbye. Christy first hugged Caleb. He hugged his mother tightly and said quietly, "Mom, take care of yourself there, okay? We'll manage." Tears welled up in her eyes. "Of course, you can handle it. I'm proud of you. And please, study well and then tell me about your successes." Caleb nodded and released her from his embrace. Then Christy turned to her youngest son. Jake was shifting from one foot to the other, looking at the floor. She hugged him gently, though he didn't return the strong grip. "I'll call you every day, do you hear?" she whispered, patting his back. "And you too, just call me anytime." The boy just nodded, burying his face in her shoulder for a second. "Bye, Mom," he squeezed out barely audibly. Finally, Christy met her husband's gaze. Dan stood with his hands in his jeans pockets. His face was tense, but he was trying to hold on. He stepped forward and put his arms around his wife. "I love you," he said quietly in her ear. Christy pressed herself against him for a moment, feeling the familiar, homey scent of his jacket. "I love you too. Thank you for everything. For letting me go." He shook his head, pulling away. "I hope it's worth it." She nodded, wiping away tears. Then, steeling herself, she turned and headed toward security. She glanced back one last time to see her family standing together, her husband with a hand on each son's shoulder. They were so close, and they were being left behind. An hour later, the plane lifted off from the runway. Looking out the window at the city disappearing into the distance, Christy felt both fear and excitement. On the plane, looking out the window at the mountains and deserts passing below, Christy could not sit still from a mixture of fear and excitement. Her new life began above the clouds, under the wings of an airliner carrying her to the west. A warm August day in California greeted Christy with bright sunshine and the scent of eucalyptus. As she stepped out of the San Francisco airport, she felt the dry, hot breath of the West Coast on her skin. Everything around her seemed new and foreign. The palm trees along the road, the multilingual speech of tourists and students crowding at the bus stop. Christy could hardly believe that she was really here. She was met by a representative of the university program, a smiling guy holding a sign that said, "Stanford Reboot Program." He helped her load her luggage into the van and chatted casually about local attractions on the way to campus. Christy looked out the window at the passing landscapes. Hills lined with light-colored houses, at company campuses with bright logos, and finally, the university itself. Stanford University struck her with its scope. Spacious green lawns, a palm-lined alley leading to the main buildings with red tile roofs, everything looked like a picture from a movie. The minibus stopped at the dorm. Christy exhaled and got out, wrapping her hand around the strap of her bag. She was housed in the campus for graduates and participants of a special program, a small modern building with individual studio rooms. The receptionist gave her a key card and a welcome pack, brochures, a campus map, a schedule of orientation events. Having climbed to the third floor, Christy found her room. Small, but bright and cozy, a bed, a desk by the window, a closet, and a private bathroom. On the table, there was a basket with a welcome card from the university. Leaving her suitcases by the wall, she went to the window. It overlooked the dormitory courtyard, where students were already walking. Some were clearly the same age as her son's young men and women, laughing, with backpacks on their shoulders. But there were also older people, probably graduate students or participants in that same program for adults like her. For a moment, Christy felt like an outsider, a 40-year-old housewife among all these smart young people. Will she be able to fit in? Taking out her phone, she took several photos of the view from the window and sent them to her family. "I got here. I'm fine. Here's my room." After a while, Dan responded with a thumbs-up emoji and the words, "Good luck in your new place. Love you." Her heart sank with homesickness, but she pushed it aside. She had her first event ahead of her, and she couldn't be late. That evening, the inauguration of the new student program took place. The large auditorium was filled with hundreds of freshmen, graduate students, and people like her who had returned to school. Christy sat in the middle, next to a woman in her 30s who also looked a little lost. They exchanged a few words. She was from Texas, had given up her law career to get an MBA. The rector came out on stage and congratulated everyone on the start of the semester. Then several professors spoke, talking about the values of the university and the opportunities that awaited students. Christy listened, trying to absorb every word. It seemed to her that she had entered another world, a world of science, innovation, free thinking. After many years of measured life in the suburbs, everything around her seemed to be boiling with the energy of ideas. Finally, a professor was invited to the podium, whose name caused excitement in the hall. Thomas Reed, head of the Modern History Department. Thomas Reed, Christie somehow found the name familiar. Perhaps she had read his articles online. A short, stocky man of about 45, with gray hair at the temples and lively gray eyes, he began his speech simply, without a note. "Dear students," he said, casting an attentive glance around the room. "You and we, the teachers, have an exciting journey ahead of us. The university is not just lectures and exams. It is a place where the most diverse views collide, where new ideas are born. I am especially glad to welcome here those who came to education having gained life experience. Your experience is invaluable, and we will all learn from each other." Christie felt as if these words were addressed to her personally. Thomas Reed spoke with inspiration, but without pathos, about how knowledge helps to understand the world and yourself, how it is never too late to learn and change your life. The hall listened with intense attention. She caught every phrase, mentally agreeing. At some point, Professor Reed glanced in their direction, and it even seemed to her that for a moment their eyes met. Christie was embarrassed and looked down, feeling her cheeks warming. After the official part, a buffet began. Students went off in small groups to chat over a glass of juice and snacks. Watching the groups of young students excitedly discussing their plans for school and future projects, Christie felt a little giddy. These kids were in their early 20s, full of energy and hope. She caught snippets of conversation, someone talking about the startup they were working on at night, someone sharing their impressions of a trip to Asia. It was all so far from her old life that it seemed like an alien world. She wanted to talk to someone too, but the fear of seeming ridiculous paralyzed her. Inside, a battle was going on between new enthusiasm and old insecurity. The woman from Texas quickly disappeared among her acquaintances, and Christie moved to the wall, holding a glass of water, and looked around. Conversations were bubbling everywhere about specialties, courses, plans. She felt a little lonely, but then a pleasant female voice was heard nearby. "You don't know anyone either, do you?" Christie turned around. There was a short girl in her early 20s wearing big glasses. She was smiling and friendly. "To be honest, no one," Christie answered. "Me too," the girl shrugged. "I'm in the master's program in sociology. You, I believe, are in the program for—" "Excuse me, I don't want to offend, for older students." Christie smiled back. "Yes, that's right. My name is Christie." "And I'm Marion," the girl introduced herself. "It's great that you decided to go back to school. My mother keeps saying that she would also like to get a second education, but she just can't get around to it." "Well, tell her it's real," Christie said warmly. They started talking. Marion turned out to be from California and asked Christie about her hometown and her children. Christie was happy to tell her about her family, although she tried not to go into too much detail. It was nice to just talk to someone friendly. Half an hour later, when the room began to empty, Marion waved over Christie's shoulder to someone. "Oh, I have to go. I'll see my supervisor. It was nice to meet you. See you on campus." The girl left, and Christie was left alone. She sighed and decided that it was time for her to go back to the dorm to rest after a long day. On her way out, she saw Professor Reed again, standing surrounded by students who were animatedly asking him about something. Thomas Reed smiled as he answered, and he looked so natural and friendly that Christie couldn't help but admire him. but she immediately reminded herself that he was just a famous scientist, and she was an ordinary student, and much older than most of those around her. This thought suddenly made her feel tired. Back in her room, Christy sat on her bed. The first day in her new place was over. So many impressions, new faces. She felt a little lonely, but also excited by the realization. She did it. She was at Stanford. She was a student again. She took out her phone, rereading the warm message from Dan and the boys wishing her luck. She felt a little sad, but also warm from their support. "I can do this," she repeated to herself once more, drawing the curtain. Then she turned off the light and went to bed, looking forward to tomorrow, full of new ideas and knowledge. A few days after classes began, Christy had to attend her first seminar, Modern History, taught by Professor Thomas Reed. She was a little nervous, as history was not her major, but the free time in her schedule allowed her to sign up out of curiosity. Deep down, she knew that she was drawn to the course, not only because of her love of history, but also because she wanted to hear the same professor who had so impressed her at the opening talk speak intelligently again. The classroom was small and cozy, a long oval table with a dozen students seated around it. They were all graduate or senior students. Christy felt curious glances her age must have stood out. She chose a seat in the middle of the table and opened her laptop to take notes. Professor Reed soon entered, carrying a stack of books under his arm. Today, he was wearing a light gray shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He looked energetic and friendly. "Good morning," he began, looking around at the assembled group. "I hope everyone has had time to read the articles for today's seminar." The students nodded, and there were isolated yeses. "Excellent," Thomas Reed smiled. "Then let's begin. The topic today is social movements of the 60s in the USA and their influence on the present day." He captured the audience's attention from the very first minutes. Christy listened, trying not to miss a word. Professor Reed did not simply retell the material. He asked questions, gave examples, joked. After some time, the discussion became lively. Several students expressed their opinions on the reasons for the protests of those years. Christy was silent for a long time, listening. But when the professor asked about the role of women in the civil rights movement, she suddenly raised her hand. "Yes, Christina, I think." The professor addressed her encouragingly, quickly remembering her name. She nodded and spoke nervously. "I think it played an important role that many women then had the opportunity to express their opinions publicly for the first time. For example, my mother told me how, when she was young, she took part in a march against the Vietnam War. For her, it was her first experience of solidarity. She said that she felt part of something bigger." There was silence in the classroom as she spoke. A few students listened with interest. Professor Reed inclined his head. "A most valuable personal perspective. Thank you, Mrs. Lawson." Christy felt a warmth from having her point of view valued. She felt more confident in the discussion that followed. The seminar flew by. When it ended, the students began to leave, some lingering to ask the instructor questions. Christy was in no hurry to leave, putting her things in her bag. Her soul was seething with delight. She hadn't been so interested in a class for a long time. And Professor Reed, he exceeded her expectations. He spoke about the subject so vividly, passionately. It was infectious. "Mrs. Lawson," a voice said nearby. She looked up. Thomas Reed was standing next to her, still holding several books in his hands. The rest of the students had already left the room, except for one girl who was waiting by the door. "Yes?" Christy stood up quickly, feeling slightly confused that the teacher was addressing her personally. "I wanted to thank you for your contribution to the discussion today," the professor said. "It's always great when students share their personal family experiences. It enriches our conversation." "Thank you," she replied, feeling her cheeks warming up again. "I was a little nervous. It's been a while since I've spoken in front of an audience." Reed smiled kindly. "Nothing noticeable. You formulated your thoughts very clearly. You must have returned to your studies after a break." "Yes, you could say that," Christy nodded. "It's been more than 20 years since I went to university." "Impressive. He raised his eyebrows. That means you have a wealth of life experience. Students like these are a real treasure for our seminars. Christy smiled sheepishly. She was pleased to hear that. I'm trying to make up for lost time. The professor nodded and thought for a second, then said, Listen, if you're interested in the topic of women's movements, next week we're having an unscheduled meeting of the History Circle, and they're going to discuss the evolution of feminism. If you want to join, I invite you. It'll be informal, over a cup of tea. Oh, I'd be very interested, Christy perked up. Thank you for the invitation. Then I'll email you the details. Reed smiled and pulled out a business card. Here's my university email. If you have any questions about the course or anything else, just write. Christy carefully took the card. The thick paper had the name Professor Thomas Reed and contact information printed on it. Thank you. I'll be sure to write if I need anything. Excellent. He glanced at his watch. Well, I have to get to the faculty meeting. Thanks again for your participation, Christina. She nodded. Thank you. Goodbye. He headed for the exit. The student who was waiting at the door immediately began asking him her question, and they disappeared into the corridor. Christy was left alone with her thoughts. On the way to the dorm, she couldn't help but smile. The professor had paid attention to her, praised her. Moreover, he had invited her to an extracurricular event. She desperately wanted to call someone right away and share her impressions. Dan was the first to come to mind, but she knew her husband wouldn't share her enthusiasm. He didn't even know their names, and he was unlikely to be happy about how excited she was about the university. During lunch in the dining room, Christy still managed to type a short message to her husband. Everything is fine. The classes are interesting, a lot of new things. How are you doing there? The answer didn't come right away. It was probably late evening at home. Dan only replied a couple of hours later. We're fine. Bought Jake some new sneakers for training. He's still pouting. Good night. Reading this, Christy felt a pang of guilt. Her family was living their lives without her, and she was sinking deeper into this new world. She tried to imagine what Dan was doing now, putting Jake to bed, perhaps, or checking his homework. Caleb was probably already in his room doing his homework. She suddenly felt ashamed that instead of missing them, she was thinking about inviting the professor to a club. That night, Christy lay in bed, unable to fall asleep. Thomas Reed's smiling face and velvety voice appeared before her eyes. She found herself longing to see him again at that circle meeting, at the next seminar, anywhere. The thought was both terrifying and exciting. Stop, she tried to reason with herself. He's just a teacher who's passionate about his work. He's just as attentive to all the students. But another voice inside objected. No, not to all of them. He's interested in you. He came up to you himself and invited you. Christy sighed and rolled over onto her other side. She didn't want to admit it, but the fact remained. She was attracted to this man. But she was a married woman, far from her family, but... I just lack attention, it will pass, she told herself, closing her eyes. In the darkness of the dorm room, the light of the computer flickered, but her heart could not calm down. The temptation continued to grow, fueled by every memory of Thomas Reed's smile. At first, Christy tried to call home every day, as she had promised. But the time difference made things difficult. When she had a free slot in the evening between classes, it was already a deep night at home. And in the morning, before her classes, dawn was just breaking in Pennsylvania, and the family was still asleep. Sometimes she tried to call him in the evening, after her lectures, forgetting about the time difference. No one answered because it was the middle of the night at home. Once she was woken up by a call at 4 in the morning. It was Dan calling from work during lunch, having mixed up the time zones. They both apologized, realizing how awkward it was to keep in touch. Such trifles only increased the distance between them. We had to specifically agree on a time for calls. One Sunday afternoon, a couple of weeks into school, Christy scheduled a video call for noon California time, 3 o'clock at home, a convenient time when everyone was free. She excitedly opened the laptop in her room and started the video chat. The screen showed Dan and his sons sitting on the living room couch. Christy noticed Jake looking away and Caleb waving at her with a forced smile. "Hello, my dear," she said happily, adjusting the camera. "How are you?" "Hey, Mom," Caleb said. "We're fine." Dan nodded. "Hello, how are you?" "I'm doing great," Christy began enthusiastically. "So much is happening. School is interesting. I've met people from all over the world. Yesterday, there was a history club meeting. We discussed the feminist movement. It was very interesting." She saw her husband's face tense for a moment. "History club?" he asked again. "I think you're studying design." "Well, I have a couple of extra electives," Christy explained. "There's a great history professor, Thomas Reed, remember I mentioned. He invited me to an extracurricular discussion, so I went." Dan chuckled briefly. "I see." In the ensuing pause, Christy quickly changed the subject. "How are the kids? How is school? Caleb, how are the college applications going?" The eldest son shrugged. "It's fine. I applied to Penn State and a couple of smaller ones. The answers won't come soon." "Great. I'm sure they'll accept you." The mother smiled warmly. "And you, Jake, how are you? How's the section?" The younger son was silent the whole time, looking now at the phone, now at the window. Hearing a direct question, he reluctantly looked at the camera. "Fine. He scored a goal in the match yesterday," Dan interjected, putting his arm around his son's shoulder, but Jake only shrugged. "Really? Congratulations, darling," Christy exclaimed. "Why are you silent? This is great." Jake shrugged. "Oh, come on. Dad was at the game. He saw it." Christy's heart sank. She wasn't there for her son's big event. She tried to keep a smile on her face. "I'd love to see it too, you know. Maybe you could send me the video if you filmed it." "We don't have a normal camera, and I forgot to take a picture on my phone," Dan replied, scratching his cheek. "And nothing special, a regular school match." "This is not normal for me," Christy said softly. "Jake, I'm so proud of you." The boy didn't answer, looking down again. In the silence, someone on the other end of the microphone sighed, either Dan or his son. "Well," Christy said uncertainly, feeling that the conversation was not going well. "Tell me what else is new. How's the weather? It's still hot here." "It's already colder here. It's autumn after all," the husband responded. For a few minutes they chatted about trivialities. The weather, the neighbors, the fact that the dishwasher was broken. Christy wanted to give advice, but Dan said dryly that he had already called a repairman. Gradually, the conversation petered out. Finally, Christy said, "I miss you. A lot." "Yeah," Jake said without even looking at the screen. "So are we, Mom," Caleb answered for him, giving his brother a gentle nudge with his elbow. "Right, Jake?" "Aha," he muttered. Dan tried to smile. "We miss you." Christy noticed the weariness on her husband's face, the dark circles under his eyes, the unshaven stubble. She wanted to reach through the screen and touch his face, but instead she asked quietly, "Are you doing well there? How is your work?" "Just work," Dan responded. "A little tired. But that's okay." She felt the tension in his voice. Of course, he was the one doing all the housework while she was enjoying her new life here. The thought made her soul heavy. "Maybe I should come home for Christmas," she asked unexpectedly. The holidays were still a couple of months away, but she was already thinking that it would be nice to visit and support them. "We'll see," the husband answered evasively. "The tickets are expensive, and you'll probably want to go somewhere with friends there." "With friends?" Christy asked, not understanding. "Well, you communicate with everyone there, these clubs." A note of resentment slipped into Dan's voice. "You'll find something to do during the holidays." Christy frowned. "Dan, stop it. Of course, if it works out, I'll come to you." He shrugged. There was silence. Then Caleb said awkwardly, "Mom, I still have to do chemotherapy. I'll go." "Yes, yes, of course," she remembered. "Then, until then, I love you." "And we love you," the husband said quietly, but his parting smile was strained. The screen went dark. Christy sat in front of the dark monitor for a while, trying to digest the conversation. Tears welled up in her eyes. Everything was so unusually cold, so distant. Her sons seemed like strangers to her. Her husband was clearly offended. She closed the laptop and rubbed her temples tiredly. That evening, as she was going to bed, she heard the signal of an incoming message on her phone. It turned out to be Professor Reed, a short letter to the email address she had also set up to receive on her smartphone. Christina, good evening. You mentioned that you are interested in the topic of gender studies. I am sending you a list of books that I talked about at the study group. I will be glad to discuss them if any ideas come up. Sincerely, Thomas Reed. Christy read the message twice. It was nice to see the professor's concern. He actually remembered what they had talked about. Not every professor would take the time to write a recommendation to a student after a long day. She quickly typed out a response. Thank you, Professor Reed. I will definitely look at these books. Your meeting was very inspiring to me. Sincerely, Christina. Putting the phone down, she realized that her mood had improved. The unpleasant aftertaste from the difficult conversation with her family had receded a little. At least they appreciate me here, flashed through her mind, and then she reproached herself for this thought. Has she really started comparing? This would lead to nothing good. The fall semester was approaching its midpoint, and the days were getting shorter. After a busy week of classes, Professor Reed announced that on Friday evening, instead of the usual lecture, they would have a special guest, a well-known public figure who had participated in the events of the 1960s. It was supposed to be an open seminar with a discussion, which anyone could attend. Christy, of course, couldn't miss it. That evening, the history department's auditorium was packed. Even the rector and several dozen students from other departments showed up. An elderly guest speaker talked about the youth protests of half a century ago, and Thomas Reed moderated the discussion. The discussion was lively and lasted until late. When it was over, Christy realized it was past 9 o'clock. The students began to leave, chatting loudly about their impressions. She slowly walked toward the exit, holding her notes and bag. It was already dark outside. The campus lights cast a soft glow along the paths. Christina, she heard a familiar voice behind her. Turning around, she saw Professor Reed coming out of the lecture hall doors. He quickly caught up with her. How did you like the seminar? You listened so attentively, I was interested in what you thought. Christy smiled. That was amazing. So much first-hand history. Thank you for arranging this meeting. Thomas waved his hand. Thank you for coming. By the way, are you going home? It's a bit late. Let me walk you to the dorm. Oh, no need to worry. She began out of politeness, but deep down she desperately wanted to spend just a little more time with him. If it's not too much trouble. Not at all, he smiled. They walked side by side down a quiet alley strewn with fallen leaves. The night was warm, the air smelled of eucalyptus and light smoke somewhere nearby. Students were grilling sausages, celebrating the end of the week. At first, they discussed the performance, shared impressions, recalled the highlights. Christy felt how easy it was for her to talk to him. The words flowed by themselves. Thomas Reed listened attentively, sometimes asked questions, kept the conversation going with jokes. Imperceptibly, the topic of conversation shifted to something more personal. You mentioned that you have 2 children, right? He asked carefully. Yes, 2 sons, teenagers, she nodded. It must be hard to be away from them for so long, the professor remarked sympathetically. Christy sighed. It's hard. We call each other, but it's not the same. It seems like we've grown apart over the past couple of months. They're a little upset with me. It's probably not easy for them either, he said softly, but they'll grow up and understand that their mother is also a person with her own dreams. She smiled gratefully. I would like to believe it. And your husband? Did he support your decision to study here? Came the next cautious question. He supported me, Christy answered after a pause. I mean, it was hard at first, but he tried to understand. Now, though, it's hard for both of us. We've never been apart for long before. Thomas nodded, paused. Then he quietly admitted, I got divorced 5 years ago. We didn't have children, but family life also somehow diverged from my career. My wife didn't understand why I needed all these night studies, conferences. I think in the end I married science. He chuckled. I guess I failed to be a good husband. Work always came first. However, it's too late to regret it now. There was a note of bitterness in his voice. Christy felt a sharp pang of compassion for him. They paused for a moment by a small fountain, shimmering in the lantern light. "Forgive me if I'm asking something personal," she said quietly. "Do you ever get lonely?" The professor looked at her and smiled wryly. "It happens, but I'm used to it. Work fills the time." There was no one around, just the two of them, surrounded by the soft shadows of the night and the distant voices of strolling students. Christie's heart was pounding somewhere in her throat. She didn't even notice how close she was to him, the distance between them shortening when they stopped. "You are very brave, Christina," Thomas suddenly said quietly. "To start all over again at 40. I admire you." She felt warmth spreading through her chest from these words. "I thought it couldn't be any other way. Otherwise, I would regret it all my life." "I understand." He looked her straight in the eyes. "I think you can do it." They stared at each other for a few seconds, Christy unable to look away. The only sounds in the silence were the murmur of the fountain and distant laughter. Then something happened that she would not have dared to think of a month ago. Thomas Reed slowly raised his hand and gently touched her cheek, brushing away a strand of hair. His fingers lingered at her temple. Christy froze, her heart pounding. She knew she should pull away, say something, but she couldn't. He leaned a little lower, still looking into her eyes, as if giving her a chance to pull away. But she didn't pull away. She reached out to him, unable to resist. She stopped feeling time. The kiss lasted only a few seconds, but for Christy, the moment stretched out for a very long time. It was so tender and at the same time filled with emotions that had been accumulating all these weeks. She was the first to come to her senses. Christy pulled back, pressing her hand to her lips in horror. "Oh God, what are we?" she whispered, taking a step back. Thomas, as if waking up, also retreated. "Forgive me. Christina, forgive me," he said excitedly. "I shouldn't have." "No, me too," she realized, feeling everything inside her tremble. "I'm married. It's not right." They both fell silent, avoiding each other's eyes. Christy tried to pull herself together. She was drawn to him, but at the same time, she was overcome with guilt before her husband and children. Finally, Thomas said quietly, "Let me walk you to the door. It's not far." She nodded silently. They moved further down the path. A couple of minutes later, the entrance to her dorm appeared. Christy stopped at the stairs. "Thank you for seeing me off," she said quietly, lowering her eyes. Thomas stopped in front of her, his shoulders hunched. "Christina, I didn't mean to hurt you or make you uncomfortable." "It's all right," she said quickly, without looking up. "It's just an impulse. We'd better forget about it." She couldn't believe she was saying this. Every cell in her body screamed the opposite, that this kiss had finally revived her, bringing back a long-forgotten feeling of closeness. But her mind demanded that she slow down. "As you say," the professor answered quietly. "Good night." "And to you, Thomas," she added after a pause. He turned and walked away down the alley, disappearing into the gloom. Christy watched him until his figure disappeared around the corner. Only then did she allow tears to well up in her eyes. Tears of something: relief, sadness, elation, all at once. She knew she had crossed the line, but there was no turning back time. The day after that memorable kiss, Christy woke up with a heavy heart. She had barely slept, tormented by guilt. Several unread messages and missed calls from Dan flashed on her phone screen. Anxiously, she opened her husband's latest messages. "Christy, call back urgently. Why aren't you in touch? Jake's in trouble. We need your answer now." Her heart sank. She had missed something important at home. With trembling hands, Christy immediately dialed Dan's number. He answered almost immediately in a sharp voice. Finally, "Dan, what happened?" she blurted out in one breath. On the other end, his tense breathing could be heard for a couple of seconds. Then an explosion followed. "It happened. As if you didn't know. I've already written to you 10 times. I'm sorry, I was busy and didn't see right away." Christy began to justify herself, trying to stay calm. "Busy? With your seminars again?" My husband's voice was seething with sarcasm. "Of course, you have a social circle there, a new life. And your son, meanwhile, is in a fight at school." "A fight?" Christy pressed her hand to her mouth. "Oh my God, Jake got into a fight. Is he okay?" "Physically, yes," Dan snapped. "But he got suspended for a week. And you know why? Because some kid let it slip in front of everyone that his mother had abandoned the family. Our Jake couldn't take it anymore." Christy felt the ground slipping from under her feet. Her boy had stood up for her, and suffered because of her. Her head was spinning with guilt and horror. "Oh God," was all she could manage to squeeze out. "Poor Jake." "Yes, poor thing," Dan repeated coldly. "He's already having a hard time, and now these rumors are spreading." "What rumors?" she asked, alarmed. The husband smiled mirthlessly. "What do you think? People say that Christy Lawson has moved to the other side of the country, leaving her husband and children. A great reputation, right? But that's not true. I didn't quit, I." "Oh no," he interrupted angrily. "And who is with us now? Who cooks dinner for the children and checks their homework? Who takes them to the doctors? Aren't you doing this from 3,000 miles away?" "Dan, you know why I left," she said plaintively. "I didn't do it out of a good life. I wanted to fulfill my dream." "Yes, I remember," he interrupted. "And what are we doing here? Should we stand aside and wait while you assert yourself?" Christy felt a wave of irritation rising in response. "It's not fair to say that. I've dedicated many years to my family, and you know it. Can't you wait 1 year? I'd like to see how you'd endure it if I ran away for a year," my husband snapped. "But this is different." She tried to object. "Nothing else," Dan screamed. "We need you, damn it, and you're not here. And now my son gets into fights because his mother isn't around, and they laugh at him." There was a ragged breath on the line. Christy was crying, but she wiped away her tears with a trembling hand, trying to answer. "Forgive me. Forgive me. I didn't know." "Of course I didn't know," he said bitterly. "You weren't there. You were having fun there. You had a new company." He stopped mid-sentence. Christy tensed. "Finish it. I know what you want to say." "You know," Dan snorted. "Very interesting." "What do I mean?" She swallowed the lump in her throat. "You think I forgot about you, that I don't care about my family. Isn't that so?" He almost whispered, and suddenly his voice sounded tired instead of angry. "Christy, we call you, we write. You show up every other time. Always busy, always tired after your meetings. You move away from us every day. I feel it. It's just hard for me." She began incoherently, studying assignments. "Don't lie to yourself at least," Dan said softly but very firmly. "We're already second in your priority list, and maybe even third." Christy fell silent. There was truth in his words, and she had no arguments against it. She heard muffled sobs, either her own or Jake's, somewhere near her husband. I'm so sorry," she finally said through her tears. "I love you. I miss you. It just didn't turn out the way I thought." "Yeah," Dan responded bitterly. "Okay, we need to decide with the school principal what to do next. I'll explain. I'll try to make sure they don't put me on record. Please hug Jake for me. Tell him that I'm guilty," Christy asked, choking on tears. "He doesn't even want to hear about you now," the husband snapped. The words cut her hard, but she knew they were true. There was silence on the other end. Finally, Dan said wearily, "I don't know, Chris. I don't know what to do next. Honestly, I could interrupt my studies and come back," she suddenly suggested uncertainly, surprised that she had said it. "It's too late," he replied. What's the point of ruining everything now? The children won't forget you anyway, and you won't forgive yourself." He smiled bitterly. "Learn already. Just know that everything is going to hell here. I have to go. Jake is calling. It's good that at least Caleb is behaving calmly. Please tell them." She began, but her husband had already hung up. The beeps on the phone sounded loud and sharp. Christy sat on the edge of the bed, her head in her hands. Here it was, the storm she had never suspected. A family storm that had broken out thousands of miles away, and she could do nothing to help her loved ones cope with the disaster. She felt worthless, guilty, and crushed. Tears were rolling down her cheeks, and there was no power to stop them. She remembered one happy episode. A couple of years ago, the whole family of 4 had been walking in an amusement park. They laughed, ate cotton candy, and took pictures. At the time, Christy had thought that these moments would always be repeated, but now it seemed that that carefree family had existed in another life, which had ended forever. Another 2 weeks passed. Christy's relationship with Thomas Reed remained uncertain. They tried to act normal in class, though the glances they occasionally exchanged spoke volumes. They hadn't discussed the incident since the kiss, but the tension was in the air. Christy was torn between remorse and the quiet joy of feeling close again. She communicated with her family less and less. After a major quarrel with Dan, conversations were limited to dry exchanges of news about the children via correspondence. Dan responded rarely and reluctantly, and Jake ignored her messages altogether. Caleb sometimes wrote a few lines saying that everything was fine. One evening, while Christy was sitting in the university library writing her next essay, her laptop suddenly began to receive notifications. First came an email from Dan with a subject and an attached file. Then, almost immediately, a message in the messenger, "How could you?" Her heart sank. Her hands went cold as she clicked on the email attachment. It was a printout of her email correspondence with Thomas Reed. As it turned out later, a notification about a letter from Thomas Reed popped up on the tablet that Christy had left at home. Dan couldn't resist opening his wife's email, and that's how the truth came out. The conversation, turned inside out on the screen, initially consisted of neutral, official messages about the schedule of seminars and books to read. But with each line, the tone changed to something more personal. Tender notes, compliments, agreements to meet on campus late at night, and then the culmination, a letter from Thomas a week ago. Several letters in a row, first formal ones about studies, then more personal. Here is a line from his letter from a week ago. "I can't stop thinking about you. Last night was special." And here is her answer. "I also think about you all the time. It scares me, but it also makes me happy." Christy couldn't read any further. The letters swam before her eyes. She froze, staring at the screen. One thought pounded in her head. Dan knows everything. The phone vibrated to life. An incoming call from her husband. Christy slid her finger across the screen with difficulty. "Hello?" Her voice broke. The answer came from a cry she had never heard before from the usually reserved Dan. "Is it true? Are you sleeping with him?" She instinctively glanced around. A few students at nearby tables looked up. Christy slammed her laptop shut and ran out of the reading room into the hallway. "Dan," she whispered, "please, let's be calm." "Calm down," he roared into the receiver. "I'm going crazy. How long has this been going on? That's why you went there, right?" "No," she cried back, raising her voice too. "Of course not. It was an accident. We didn't." She faltered, not knowing what to say. "You don't sleep, you mean?" He laughed sharply. "You're lying. The correspondence showed everything." "Dan, we only met a couple of times. I didn't plan to. It all happened unexpectedly," she tried to explain through her tears. "You weren't planning to," he mimicked. "Read the correspondence. It's all confessions. Don't pretend it was an accident." Christy felt a lump in her throat. I didn't mean to lie to you." "But you lied," he shouted. "It's all clear. Even then I felt that you were busy with more than just studying. Damn, how disgusting." There was a thud on the line, as if he had hit something hard with his fist. You destroyed everything, Christy. Our family, our life. For what? For some professor? Dan's voice broke into a croak. I'm sorry. She squeezed out, shedding tears. I don't know how this happened. I missed you. I was lost. You didn't have enough, did you? He mimicked. And do you think I had enough? I worked here like crazy, and I believed in you. I waited for you. And you. He paused, then said with icy clarity, That's it. I've had enough. What? What does this mean? She asked, frightened. That means I'm filing for divorce, Dan snapped. And for full custody of the kids. They don't need a traitorous mother. Christie's legs gave out, and she slid down the wall, sitting on the cold hallway floor. Don't say that, she whispered pleadingly. Please, let's try. Let's try, he flared up again. It's too late to try. You've crossed the line. Go back to your lover and your books. There was such hatred in these words that she shuddered. I'll come. I'll explain everything. She began to say through her tears, Don't deprive me of my children, I beg you. It's too late, he repeated harshly. You've made your choice. She sobbed in response, but the line was already ringing. Briefly, Dan had disconnected. With difficulty, Christy rose to her feet and wandered toward the library exit. Her ears were ringing, her heart was pounding. The world was crumbling around her. Everything secret has become clear, her betrayal has been exposed, and it seems there is no way back. On the street, she automatically dialed Thomas's number. Her hands were shaking so much that she had to sit down on a bench. He didn't answer right away. Apparently, he was busy at the department. Christina? A surprised voice rang out. Are you okay? No. She burst into tears into the phone, losing all composure. Dan. He found out everything. Our letters. God, Thomas, he's filing for divorce. The professor was silent for a while. Then he asked seriously, Where are you? Are you alone? Yes, I'm near the library. She squeezed out. Wait there, I'll be right there, he said decisively, and passed out. Christy covered her face with her hands, sitting on that bench in the dark corner of the yard. She was afraid to go back to the empty room, afraid to think about the future. A few minutes later, she heard hurried footsteps nearby. She looked up with tear-stained eyes. Thomas Reed was hurrying toward her, without a jacket, with an expression of anxiety on his face. Without saying a word, he sat down next to her and hugged her. Christy leaned against his shoulder, letting her sobs flow. They sat like that for a long time until her crying subsided. I'm with you, Thomas said quietly when she had calmed down a little. Whatever happens. Asterisk, asterisk, he stroked her back, repeating words of comfort. Forgive me. If it weren't for me, nothing would have happened, he said with pain. No, it's all my fault, she sobbed. Thomas shook his head and hugged her tighter. Christy just closed her eyes tighter, realizing that they were in for a difficult test that she had brought upon her family. A few days after her big breakup with her family, Christy was in a strange, distant state. She continued to go to class, automatically fulfilling the course requirements, but often found herself not remembering what the lecture was about or where she was going. Thomas was there, trying to support her, bringing her coffee, asking how she was, but he, too, could not numb her pain and guilt. One evening, Christy was sitting in her room, scrolling through her social media feed. Her page had been empty for a long time, except for the occasional photo of campus for her friends. But today, her feed showed her a photo of a former classmate who, at 40-something, had run a marathon and wrote an inspiring post about, "It's never too late to start over." Christy read the post, and everything inside her stirred. It's never too late to start living again. These words seemed to reflect what she herself was going through. At first, she typed a couple of sentences and immediately erased them, unable to find the right words. Then she decided to write without thinking about the reaction, but simply to express what was bothering her. Her fingers were shaking, but she typed word after word, pouring out her pain and excuses. At 40, I suddenly realized that I had been living someone else's life all my life. I was a good wife, a loving mother, and an exemplary housewife. But deep down, I felt empty. Society expects self-sacrifice from a woman for the sake of her children, for the sake of her husband. And I gave 20 years to my loved ones. But doesn't a woman have the right to dream about her own? Should age be a death sentence? I decided to break out of the golden cage of a cozy life. I decided to fulfill my long-time dream to get an education, see the world, and realize myself. It was not easy. I faced misunderstanding and condemnation. Many will say that I am selfish, but I believe a happy woman can give more to her loved ones than a driven and devastated one. I don't encourage anyone to follow my path. It's hard and painful, but I feel like I'm getting stronger every day, despite the losses. My heart aches for those I've hurt, but I won't let shame or fear keep me caged anymore. This is my statement about the right to myself, about the right of a woman to emancipation, even when everyone around says that it is too late to change anything. She reread what she had written, wiping away tears. The post contained the truth of her emotions, but not the whole truth of the situation. She had not mentioned a word about her husband or betrayal, only vague phrases about condemnation and loss. She wanted to believe that in this way she was explaining her actions, first of all, to herself. Christy hit publish and closed her laptop, feeling both relieved and anxious. She felt like she was delivering a confession from a stage, unsure of how the audience would react. The reaction was not long in coming. When she returned to her phone an hour later, there were already dozens of comments under the post. Some friends from California and a couple of old girlfriends liked it and wrote words of support. "You are so brave. I'm proud of your determination, girl." But there were other responses too. A neighbor in the neighborhood, with whom they had once been family friends, left an angry message. "What about your children, Christina? They don't need a victim, they need a mother." One of my husband's former colleagues asked sarcastically, "Emancipation, is it now a synonym for the word egoism?" Each such jab made her feel guilty again. But Christie stubbornly answered everyone in the same public vein, trying to hold on. "The children will grow up and understand that their mother has dreams too. Selfishness is forcing a woman to deny herself." She was supported by several new university friends who took up the argument with the critics. However, the most painful comment was the one that appeared a couple of hours later in the evening from Caleb's account. The Sun wrote briefly and succinctly, "Stop making excuses." And that's all. Seeing these 3 words, Christy felt like she had been slapped in the face. She immediately responded, "Caleb, I'm not making excuses, I'm just trying to explain." But the Sun didn't write anything else and soon deleted his comment and then completely disabled his profile. Christie's hands dropped. She realized that this public post, which she thought would help her find her voice and self-respect, was actually hurting those closest to her more deeply. That night, she did not sleep for a long time. The laptop screen still flickered, showing new reactions, but she no longer cared. Her attempt to proclaim emancipation turned into even greater misunderstanding, and if at first there was a glimmer of resistance in her like, "No one will understand me, but I am right," then by morning it died out, leaving only a heavy emptiness. She suddenly felt clearly, no loud words will free her from responsibility for what she did. Meanwhile, in Pennsylvania, Dan saw the post too. A mutual friend forwarded him a screenshot, indignant. Reading his wife's words about a gilded cage and the right to oneself, he only chuckled bitterly. Emancipation. "Well, well," he said in the empty room and closed the laptop, feeling even angrier than before. This public manifesto only strengthened his resolve to quickly sever all the threads that connected them. A few weeks after the betrayal was exposed, Christie had to return to Pennsylvania to file for divorce. The court hearing was scheduled for late winter. She lived out those months in a fog. She officially took an academic leave, no longer showed up for classes. Thomas tried to persuade her not to drop out, but she could think of nothing but the upcoming trial and the fate of her children. On the morning of the hearing, Christie showed up at the county courthouse dressed in a black suit. Her hands were shaking, and her chest was tight with a mixture of fear and shame. She spotted Dan and his lawyer in the hallway outside the courtroom. Caleb and Jake were sitting nearby, invited as the older children to weigh in on the custody matter. The boys looked older and more distant. Christy came closer timidly. Their eyes met for a moment. Caleb pressed his lips together and nodded to his mother in greeting, his eyes sad. Jake turned away, pretending to look at the plaque on the wall. Before Christy could say anything, the secretary's voice came from the hall. The case of Carlisle v. Lawson is called to the courtroom. Everyone stood up. Dan, not once looking at his ex-wife, led his sons forward, followed by his lawyer with a folder. Christy, swallowing, followed them along with her lawyer, an older woman with a knowing look, hired only a week ago. The high courtroom with its oak benches weighed on her with its formality and coldness. At the long table, Dan sat with his representative on one side, and she with her lawyer on the other. The meeting was almost a formality. Her lawyer tried to whisper to her to at least ask for joint custody or regular visits, but Christy just shook her head. She didn't dare ask for conditions after what she had done. Christy had essentially agreed to all of her husband's demands, to give him sole custody of the children, to leave him the house and car, to refuse any support. Her lawyer tried to object about the property, but Christy just shook her head. She didn't want anything except some chance to improve her relationship with her sons in the future. Miss Lawson, do you acknowledge that you voluntarily signed the property and custody agreement? The judge asked, looking at her carefully over his glasses. Christy felt all eyes turn to her. Her throat was dry, but she forced herself to answer firmly. Yes, Your Honor. Do you realize that the children will live with their father, and that your meetings with them are only possible with the father's consent or by separate agreement? The judge continued. At these words, her voice trembled treacherously. I realize. A few rows ahead, she saw Jake bury his face in his older brother's shoulder, not wanting to hear the details. Christy's heart sank in pain. Caleb was rubbing his brother's back, staring straight ahead. The judge said something else about the marriage being officially dissolved, about the procedures. Finally, the judge officially announced the decision. The marriage between Christina Lawson and Daniel Carlisle is dissolved. Full custody of the minor children is transferred to the father, Daniel Carlisle. The property is divided in accordance with the amicable agreement of the parties. These words echoed like a hammer in Christy's temples. She heard the hammer, and it was all over. Her marriage to Dan Carlisle was now history. Dan and his lawyer stood up, shaking hands. The sons stood up too. Christy moved toward them automatically, but Dan gave her such a cold look that she froze. Caleb seemed about to say something, but his father stopped him with a gesture and led both boys out of the room. She was left standing in the middle of the emptying courtroom while her lawyer gathered up her papers. She spoke sympathetically. Christina, I understand how hard it is for you. If you want, I can recommend a good psychologist. But Christy just shook her head. Her whole life was now divided into before and after. The paper bag with copies of the agreements seemed unwieldy to her. She thanked the lawyer and walked out of the courthouse on stiff legs. The cold February wind howled outside. Christy stood at the courthouse steps, watching Dan load his sons into the car. She froze, hoping for some kind of look, some kind of sign. Caleb noticed her and raised his hand for a moment, either saying goodbye or trying to support her. Jake sat with his back turned. Dan, following his gaze, glanced at his ex-wife. There was no anger or pain in his eyes, only emptiness. He got behind the wheel and slammed the door. The car drove away, leaving her alone on the courthouse steps. Snowflakes swirled in the icy air, landing on her hair and shoulders. Christy didn't even feel the cold. She stood and watched until the car of the family she was no longer a part of disappeared around the corner. Christy returned to California after the trial as a changed person. At the beginning of the spring semester, she officially took a leave of absence. The energetic student she had once been was gone. The days were empty and colorless. She rarely left her small room on campus, lying on her bed for hours, staring at the ceiling. She had lost weight and looked haggard. The mirror had long since become her enemy. Nights passed almost without sleep. As soon as she fell asleep, she was awakened by nightmares or anxiety. During the entire day, she could only say a few words out loud, answer the cashier at the store, or thank the neighbor who held the door. The world narrowed to the walls of the room and lingering thoughts about the past. At first, Thomas spent all his free time with her. He picked her up from the airport, tried to distract her, brought her food, offered to walk by the ocean and go to San Francisco. But Christy refused. She felt broken. As soon as she closed her eyes, she saw Dan's cold gaze or the backs of her sons walking away. A couple of weeks later, Thomas came to her in the evening with 2 mugs of hot chocolate. Christy was sitting by the window, wrapped in a woolen blanket, although the room was not cold. "You've hardly eaten today," he gently chided, holding out the mug. She shook her head. "Thank you. I don't want to." He sighed and put the mugs down on the table. "This can't go on, Chris. You need to move on." "To live on," she repeated bitterly. "For what? It's all over." "Don't say that." Thomas squatted down in front of her chair, trying to catch her eye. "You have me. We have each other. That's not a small thing." Christy looked somewhere through him. "Thomas, you have your career, your students, and I have no family, no studies, nothing." "You can resume your studies," he reminded me. "The children will grow up. Perhaps in time they will be able to forgive you." "Forgive me," she suddenly laughed hoarsely. "Me? Never. They hate me. I hate myself." Thomas stood up and took her hands. "You made a mistake, but you can't destroy yourself because of it. Talk to a psychologist, try." Christy jerked her hands away. "You think pills and talking can fix what I've done?" "No, but you need to recover for the future," he insisted carefully. "For us." She looked straight at him for the first time in a long time. Pain and anger flashed in her eyes. "Future? What future, Thomas? Did you seriously think that we would now live happily together? In love, right?" He pulled back, surprised by the abruptness. I was hoping we could build something, since it's like this." "Since it's happened that way," she repeated with a bitter smile. "It looks like it couldn't have turned out worse." "Chris," he whispered. "I'm sorry." She covered her face with her hands. "I know you're trying, but nothing makes sense." Thomas put his hand on her shoulder. "This can't go on. Let me find you a good specialist. We'll go together." "No," she said firmly, lowering her hands. "No need. I need time. And to be alone, I guess." A tense silence filled the room. Thomas nodded slowly, removing his hand. "I understand. If that's how you want it, I won't push it." He walked towards the door and stopped. "Just know, if you need me, I'm here. At any time." Christy didn't answer. As soon as the door closed behind him, she burst into tears. She felt sorry for him too. He genuinely cared for her, loved her. But now she can't respond to this love. There was only emptiness inside and an endless fall into it. One night, Thomas, frightened, even called a doctor. Christy lost consciousness in his arms after another bout of crying and refusing to eat. The doctor said it was nervous exhaustion and dehydration. She needs rest and support, otherwise the depression will only get worse, the doctor warned. Thomas did not leave her bedside, made her drink water with sugar, and sat next to her until the morning. But even this did not become a turning point for her. Nevertheless, at Thomas's urging, she agreed to see a university psychologist one day. In a stuffy office littered with pamphlets on stress, the kindly woman asked quiet questions. But as soon as the conversation turned to feelings of guilt and loss, Christy stood up, excused herself, and stormed out without saying anything. She simply didn't believe that words could help her. At night, lying awake, she couldn't help but remember happy moments from the past. There she was, so young, running along the beach, and Dan was catching up with her, laughing and spinning her around in his arms to the sound of the surf that was on their honeymoon. There they were, both smiling furtively, looking at the sleeping babies in their cribs on the first Christmas night after Jake was born. Then she felt like the happiest woman on earth. These images from her old life flashed and died, leaving behind only a suffocating melancholy. Several months passed. Spring turned to summer, and then autumn. Christy never returned to school. She moved out of the university dorms and into a rented room on the outskirts of San Jose. She had almost no savings left, so she had to economize. During the day, she worked at a small bookstore, shelving books and straightening their spines. Sometimes, standing between the bookshelves, she imagined her life if she hadn't dropped out of school all those years ago. Maybe now she would be a literature teacher or a journalist, writing her own books. At such moments, she smiled bitterly. Her dreams were too late. The owner of the shop, a kind elderly lady, knew nothing about her and did not ask unnecessary questions, for which Christy was grateful. Every morning she woke up in an empty rented room from the ringing of an alarm clock that no one else needed except her. She had a cup of instant coffee with dry toast for breakfast. She had neither the strength nor the sense to cook anything more serious. Sometimes, out of habit, she imagined how she used to wake up her sons in the morning, cook oatmeal for them, ask them not to sleep through the school bus. These memories caused almost physical pain. Now the morning silence was broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the distant noise of the city outside the window. Her home was a cramped little room in a house where several other people lived. Her room was almost empty, a narrow bed, an old closet, and a small table by a lonely window. A lamp without a lampshade glowed dimly on the wall. Almost all the things she had brought with her from California fit into one suitcase. The rest she had long ago sold or left behind. She did not seek communication with anyone. The neighbors saw her only occasionally when she quietly went into the kitchen to boil the kettle. Sometimes after work, she would take her time going home and wander aimlessly through the streets of San Jose. The city lived its own life. Music played in the parks, young people laughed in the street cafes where she sat alone with a cup of cold tea. This sunny Californian city, where she had been heading for her dream, now seemed alien and indifferent to her. She spent every evening alone. Her pain was hers alone, and there was no one to share it with. Sometimes, sitting on her narrow couch under the dim light, Christy would stare at her phone screen for hours. There were almost no new messages. Thomas had texted her a couple of times, asking how she was, offering to help. She had responded in monosyllables, after which he had stopped bothering her, deciding to give her the space she wanted. She avoided social networks. She was afraid to see happy photos of other people's families, or, worse, updates from her own children's lives, from which she excluded herself. Meanwhile, Caleb graduated from high school and was going to college. Christy found out about this from a couple of dry lines in response to her congratulations sent to him in a messenger. He thanked her and said that everything was fine. Jake did not answer at all. Several times she dialed their numbers late at night, tormented by melancholy, but each time she hung up before the call was connected, not daring to disturb their peace with her voice. The inbox on her phone was full of unread emails. One of them was from Marion, the student she had met at that first cocktail party. On impulse, Christy opened it. The letter read, "Hi, Christy. We miss you here on campus. How are you? We haven't heard from you in a while. Professor Reed asked if I knew where you were, but I told him you had a family emergency. I hope you're okay. If you want to talk or write, I'm always in touch. Hugs, Marion." Christy read the message several times. She felt ashamed that she hadn't responded to anyone, not to Marion, not to her other California acquaintances. She had simply disappeared from their lives. She didn't dare respond to Marion. What would she have written? That she had failed and given up. Instead, she deleted the notification and closed the mail app. One evening, returning from work, Christy saw a young mother with a baby at the bus stop. The boy, about 4 years old, was chatting happily, sitting on her lap, the mother, smiling, listening. Christy couldn't help but admire this scene, and suddenly her heart sank painfully. She remembered her sons at the same age, the mischievous little Jake, whom she rode on the carousel, the serious Caleb, who read books with her at night. Then it seemed to her that everything was ahead, that they had so much time. The woman and her child left on a bus, and Christy stood like a statue in the middle of the noisy street. People walked around her, hurrying about their business, but she couldn't move. Finally, a passerby touched her elbow. "Excuse me, are you okay?" Christy came to her senses. "Yeah, everything's fine," she muttered and hurried away. At home, she cried silently and for a long time, burying her face in the pillow so that no one would hear. Never before had she felt so alone. Before, even in difficult moments, she was surrounded by loved ones, her husband, children. Now there was no one nearby. Her pain belonged only to her. At such moments, her thoughts wandered to the darkest corners. It seemed to her that her life had been completely and irrevocably destroyed, that there was only emptiness ahead. She tried to find at least something that would be worth getting up in the morning. Sometimes, working in a bookstore helped her unfolding new books. She was distracted for a moment. But as soon as she returned to her room, a wave of loneliness washed over her again. Sometimes, behind the counter of the bookstore, she would take a book from the shelf and try to get carried away by reading, but her thoughts would run away. The letters would blur before her eyes as soon as she came across a description of a close-knit family or a happy ending. Tears would come to her throat. The regular customers of the bookstore saw her only as a silent saleswoman. They didn't even know her name. No one could guess what a storm of despair was hidden behind her polite, half-shifted smile. This went on day after day. It seemed like it would never end, especially since she now had plenty of time to think. Alone, Christy often replayed her entire life, step by step, trying to understand where she had taken a wrong turn. She recalled how, in her school years, she dreamed of becoming a writer or a literature teacher. How she would sit in the library for days, reading novels and making notes in her notebook. She was predicted to have a brilliant future. Teachers talked about a scholarship. Friends saw her as a journalist in a big city. Young Christy believed that if she broke out of her hometown, she would move mountains. And then there was university, her freshman year. She remembered autumn, yellow leaves on campus, the smell of coffee in the student cafeteria, piles of new textbooks. That was when she met Dan. They bumped into each other on the library stairs, laughed, and started talking. Dan was studying engineering, a senior. Tall, cheerful, he courted her with genuine delight. A few months later, they couldn't imagine themselves without each other. And a year later, their wedding, a modest ceremony in the backyard of her parents' house. She was only 19, but at the time it didn't seem too early. Christy smiled through her tears, remembering those first years of marriage. They rented a tiny apartment, ate cheap noodles, saved every penny, but were so happy together. And then Caleb was born, and there was no limit to happiness. True, with his birth, she had to make a choice. She dropped out of school, spent all day with the baby. Dan worked a lot, came home late tired, but joyfully ran into his arms. Those evenings when the three of them sat on the shabby couch, and she sang a lullaby to Caleb as he fell asleep, were perhaps the best in her life. When Jake came along 2 years later, the worries doubled. The young family moved into a bigger house, the one that would later become her golden cage. Mortgage, part-time jobs, diapers, sleepless nights, the days merged into a single endless marathon. Sometimes, falling asleep at midnight on the go, Christy thought, well, another day has passed. No reading books, no writing hobbies faded into the background. But looking at the trusting smiles of her boys, she convinced herself that everything was right. So the years flew by. Caleb and Jake grew from toddlers to teenagers. Life seemed to be getting better. The house was paid off. Her husband had built a career. The children were doing well in school. Christy again had a break to think about herself. But it seemed to her that the train had left. I'm almost 40, let alone going to college, she thought, putting another batch of dirty dishes in the dishwasher. The eternal chores justified her unwillingness to look her unfulfilled dreams in the eye. And yet, the dreams were still there. They lived somewhere deep inside, waiting for their time. Apparently, a midlife crisis had arrived when the children grew up. The daily routine became less all-consuming, and Christy suddenly felt an acute emptiness. She tried to fill it with anything. She was into yoga, took interior design courses, helped on the school's parent committee. But at night, she realized this is all not it. How she now regretted not having a real talk with her husband. Maybe if she had honestly admitted her feelings to him, everything would have gone differently. Maybe they would have found a solution together, they would have moved with the family, or she would have chosen to study closer. But she kept silent, accumulating resentment until she exploded. Like a time bomb, it quietly ticked for many years, and then blew up everything around it. These thoughts played over and over in her head, in an empty room on the outskirts of San Jose. This was her personal free fall, down through memories and regrets, with no end in sight. On a cold November evening, Christy returned home from the bookstore to find several missed calls on her phone from an unknown number in Pennsylvania. Her heart sank, and she knew in her gut that there was something wrong. Before she could think about it, her phone vibrated again. It was the same number. "Hello," she answered uncertainly. "Christina, this is Helen Carlyle," came an excited female voice on the other end. Helen, mother-in-law. Christy froze. They hadn't spoken since the breakup, for over a year. "Hello, what happened?" she blurted out. "Jake's missing," Helen blurted out. "He had a fight with his dad and left home 2 days ago. No one knows where he is. The police are looking, but—" The woman's voice faltered. "I found a printout of your address in California in his room today. He may have gone to see you." Christy felt her legs buckle. Jake could go across the country alone. "Dan knows," she breathed. "Yes," the mother-in-law answered. "He's beside himself. He and Caleb are calling friends. Christina, maybe he contacted you." "No," she whispered. "But I'll find him right now." As soon as the call was over, Christy rushed to get ready. Her hands were shaking as she typed a message to Thomas. "I have an emergency. I need a car. Jake could have come to me. I need to look." The answer came immediately. "I'm leaving." An hour later, she and Thomas were speeding north on the highway toward San Francisco. If the guess was correct, Jake might have arrived there by bus or train. Christy fidgeted with her seatbelt, looking out the window at the lights of the night highway. "We'll find him," Thomas said firmly, gripping the steering wheel. "He's probably on his way. We'll check all the flights." Christy just nodded, clutching the phone to her chest. The most terrible images flashed through her head. If only nothing happened to him. They arrived at the San Francisco bus terminal a little after midnight. Exhausted passengers were disembarking from long-distance buses. Christy rushed to the information board, peering at the list of flights from the eastern states. Finally, a flight from Chicago, via Pittsburgh and other cities. "I arrived half an hour ago." She rushed towards the people leaving, catching every face. Her heart was jumping out of her chest. There he is. A skinny teenager with a backpack in a stretched hoodie stood at the far column her boy. Even after a year, she would have recognized him out of 1,000. "Jake!" she screamed. The boy turned around at the familiar voice. Seeing his mother, he froze. His face was drawn, his eyes were red from fatigue. It seemed he couldn't believe his eyes. Christy ran up and couldn't help but hug her son. Jake stood there stiffly, not returning the hug. "Darling," she whispered, tears rolling down her cheeks. "Thank God you're alive. Why are you alone? It's so dangerous." He was silent. Then he asked quietly, "What are you doing here?" "I'm looking for you, stupid boy." She pulled away, looking into his face. "God, do you even understand how scared I was?" There was a mixture of resentment and relief in his eyes. He muttered, "I thought. You didn't care." "No, never. Do you hear me?" Christy cried out. "I care. I was just afraid that you wouldn't want to see me." Jake lowered his head. There was an awkward silence. Thomas tactfully stopped next to him, keeping a small distance. Christy exhaled and gently took her son by the shoulder. "Let's get out of here. You're probably tired and hungry." He didn't resist. They went out to the car. While Thomas was putting the backpack in the trunk, Christy sat Jake in the back seat and sat next to him, although there was little room. The car started moving. They drove in silence for some time. "Is Dad angry?" Jake suddenly asked in a whisper. He's worried, she answered carefully. He and Caleb are looking for you. I already wrote to them that you're with me. The boy turned to the window. He always yells when he's angry. Christy patted her son on the back. He's worried and doesn't know how to do anything else. It's really hard for him without you right now. It's hard for him without you, Jake said unexpectedly, without turning around. She froze. What? I heard him crying in the kitchen last night. I thought we were sleeping. He often does that. He thinks you can't hear him. Jake's voice trembled. I couldn't stand it. I left. Christy felt her heart squeeze with guilt. I'm so sorry. It's my fault. She gently hugged her son by the shoulders. This time he didn't pull away. He just closed his eyes tightly. Will you come back? He asked quietly. Christy closed her eyes, holding back tears. If you and Dad allow me, I would really like to. Jake nodded almost imperceptibly and, after a moment's hesitation, leaned sideways against her, his head resting on her shoulder. Christy held her breath, as if afraid to frighten this fragile trust. She kissed her son's head gently. For the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope. The turning point in her broken life had come so suddenly, but now she clung to it with all her might. After a day of exhausting travel, Christy and Jake found themselves in their hometown. For the boy, everything was like a blur: the flight, the transfers. He barely spoke, but was constantly next to his mother. Thomas, having taken them to the airport, said goodbye warmly, but with the understanding that Christy would have to go on alone. When the taxi pulled up to a familiar house on a quiet street late that evening, Christy's heart was pounding. Jake had already called his father to tell him he was coming back, but meeting him in person scared the shit out of her. The door of the house opened before they reached the porch. Dan was standing there. In the light of the lantern, she saw how pale he was with excitement. Caleb, now as tall as his father, peered out from behind. Jake lowered his head. Dad. Dan didn't let him finish. He hugged his son tightly, holding him tightly, closing his eyes. Christy stood a little further away, not daring to disturb this moment. Caleb ran up and hugged his brother and father too. The family was reunited for now without her. A few minutes later, Dan let go of the children and looked at his ex-wife for the first time. His gaze was a mixture of gratitude and pain. He said quietly, "Thank you for bringing it." Christy felt a lump rise in her throat. She wanted to smile, but only nodded, saying with difficulty, "I'm glad that he's okay." There was a heavy silence. Caleb cleared his throat. "Maybe we should go inside? It's cold outside." Everyone walked inside together. The light of a lamp flickered in the living room. Christy stood timidly at the entrance, without taking off her coat, feeling like a guest where she had once been the hostess. Dan, having sent his sons upstairs to rest, stayed with her. For a few seconds, they simply looked at each other. Finally, he spoke, avoiding her eyes. "I'm glad Jake is okay. Thank you." "Don't thank me," she shook her head, looking down. "It's my fault that everything is like this." "Not now," he interrupted softly. "Let's talk tomorrow. Everyone's tired. You probably need some rest, too." Christy looked up in surprise. Dan was looking at her without the same hatred as before, but rather tiredly. "I can spend the night at my mother's," she quietly suggested, referring to her neighbor from the previous block. "If it's—" "Stay here," he sighed, "in the guest bedroom." She couldn't believe it, but she thanked him and went upstairs. She barely slept all night, going over the upcoming conversation in her mind. The next morning, they were alone at the kitchen table. Caleb had left for college classes, and Jake was still asleep, exhausted from the journey. Dan poured coffee for them both, just like he had in the old days. "Christy," he began, choosing his words, "it's hard for me to express. I know you've been through as much as I have." She clasped her hands around the cup, gathering her courage. "Dan, please let me first. I have to say this." He fell silent, nodding. "There is no forgiveness for what I did," she said quietly. "I destroyed our family, betrayed you and the children. No explanation matters. I was simply selfish and stupid." Her voice broke, and she quickly wiped away her tears. I want you to know, I'm not looking for excuses. I'm just asking for your forgiveness. For everything. For hurting you, for leaving you, for letting our boys down. Dan was silent, looking away. Christy continued. I understand that you will not come back to me and will not forget this, and I will never forgive myself for this. But I really want to become a part of the children's lives again, at least a little. I will do everything you say, I will go through any conditions, if only they will allow me to be there. She pulled out a folded piece of paper from her pocket, her written address to her sons, which she had been composing all night. Well, I wrote the guys a letter of apology. My dear Caleb and Jake, I don't expect you to forgive me. I know I hurt you deeply. Every day I was away from you, I reproached myself for it. You are the most precious thing in my life, and I pushed away my happiness. I have no excuse. I just want you to know, Mom loves you very much. She has loved you all these years and continues to love you more than life itself. My escape was the biggest mistake that I will always regret. If you can ever let me back in, even just to the edge of your heart, I will do everything to earn that trust. And if not, I will understand. You have every right to be angry. In any case, I will be there, even from afar, and I will always come to your aid if you call. Forgive me. Your mother. Christy held out the letter. Dan carefully took the sheet of paper, glanced at it. He sighed heavily. Christina, he finally said hoarsely, I've been mad at you for a long time, and I'm still mad. But yesterday, when Jake went missing, for the first time, I regretted pushing you away completely. Maybe we shouldn't have put up walls so early on. He rubbed the bridge of his nose with his hand, choosing his words. I don't know what's going to happen next. The kids are really hurt. Especially Jake, he's hurt more than he lets on. But yesterday, when you found him, I saw the first glimpse of the old Jake. He's thawed out. Christy nodded, quiet tears welling up. I'm not preventing you from communicating, Dan continued. Moreover, I think he needs a mother. Caleb, he's the eldest, he coped, and the younger one is suffering a lot. I'll do everything to fix. At least something, she whispered hotly. Give them time to get used to it first, he said. Don't push, don't impose. Be close, but be careful. Of course, she agreed. There was a pause. Then Dan suddenly asked, And what about your life there? Studying that, man? Christy closed her eyes. There are no more studies. Thomas, he is good, kind, but we are not together, and I don't know if we will be. Dan nodded. It was obvious that he was uncomfortable talking about Thomas. Sure. They were silent for a moment. Then he said, I think it would be right if you stayed here for a while, until things stabilize with Jake. Christy looked up in surprise. You don't mind? Not for my son, he replied wearily. And Caleb is graduating in a couple of months. I think he'd like for you to come. Christy's breath caught in surprise. I'd love to come, if he doesn't change his mind. Dan smiled wryly. You know, after everything, I think he's realized a lot. He's not a mean guy, he was just hurt. I think by graduation he'll want his mother around. Christy couldn't help but smile through her tears. I will definitely be there, thank you. At that moment, a sleepy Jake appeared in the kitchen. Seeing his parents together at the table, he stopped in surprise. Good morning, Dan said quietly to his son. Will you have breakfast? Aha, Jake stepped closer, his gaze darting between his father and mother. Christy stood up. I'll make an omelet, your favorite, okay? She offered timidly. The guy shrugged. Well, okay. She rushed to the stove, trying to hide her excitement. A few minutes later, a fresh omelet was steaming on the table, just like in the old days. Jake ate in silence, but did not pull away when she smoothed his disheveled hair. Dan leafed through the paper, occasionally glancing sideways at them. Once their eyes met, and there was a shared understanding, there was a long way to go. But they had already taken the first step down the road to repentance and forgiveness. That same evening, she found Caleb in the living room. Summoning up her courage, Christy apologized to her eldest son, admitting that she had deprived him of a support system during his last year of school. Caleb listened silently, looking at the floor, and then quietly said, "It hurt me a lot, Mom, but I'm glad you came back for Jake, and for me too." Those words were the first ray of forgiveness for her. The warm June day that Christy had been dreaming about for the past few months arrived. The hall was decorated with blue and gold balloons, the school's colors. A banner reading, "Congratulations to the graduates," hung on the stage, and a small brass band played at the entrance, greeting the guests with festive melodies. Proud parents sat in rows, many filming the event with cameras or phones. It was Caleb's graduation day. She had gotten up early, made celebratory sandwiches in the kitchen, and carefully ironed her best outfit. She was as excited as her son. In the 6 months since their return, much had changed. Christy rented a small apartment nearby so as not to embarrass Dan, but she saw her sons almost every day. She picked up Jake from school, cooked dinners on weekends. She carefully won back their trust, step by step, one thing at a time. There were breakdowns, tears, and long heart-to-heart talks. Especially with Jake together with a family psychologist, they had to sort out a tangle of grievances. But now her boy could laugh again in her presence and even let her hug him sometimes. Relations with Dan became smooth, partnership-like. They learned to discuss children's affairs without reproach. They did not talk about personal matters. The past will remain the past. Thomas Reed wrote to her a couple of times, but she politely replied that she was staying in her homeland and should devote herself to her family. He understood and did not bother her anymore. Today, all of them, mother, father, and younger brother, were gathering together to be proud of their eldest son. Christy came to the school separately and met the family at the entrance to the assembly hall. Dan was with his mother, Helen, and Jake. At the sight of her former daughter-in-law, Helen initially wanted to maintain a strained smile, but seeing how tenderly Christy held Jake by the shoulders, the old woman only waved her hand and also nodded warmly. Time was gradually healing the wounds. The ceremony went on as usual. Graduates in blue gowns walked onto the stage, speeches were made. Christy sat next to Dan and felt everything inside her tremble with pride and excitement. Then Caleb's name was called. He walked out confidently to applause. He received his diploma and shook the director's hand. Finding his family in the hall with his eyes, Caleb raised his hand and waved cheerfully. Christy couldn't help herself. She clapped her hands, shouting louder than anyone, "Well done." After the ceremony, a crowd of graduates and their loved ones spilled out onto the schoolyard. Laughter and cameras were everywhere. Caleb soon found his family. Tall, handsome, wearing a square academic cap, Christy could hardly believe that this was the same little boy she once took to kindergarten. "Mom, Dad," Caleb smiled, hugging them one by one. "Okay, I'm officially an adult." "We're proud of you, son," Dan patted him on the back. Christy couldn't utter a word. She just hugged her son tightly, tears of joy welling up in her eyes. "Mom, don't cry," Caleb muttered embarrassedly, although he hugged her with force. "Excuse me, can I speak to you for a minute?" Someone's voice suddenly rang out nearby. Everyone turned around. The school newspaper photographer, a young guy with a camera. "Give me a photo of your family as a keepsake." Caleb nodded immediately. "Of course." He motioned for everyone to come closer. Christy stood next to her sons, putting her hand on Caleb's shoulder. Jake sat next to him, and Dan was a little behind, hugging both children. Everyone smiled for the camera. "Cut," the photographer announced and left. Caleb turned to his mother. "We're going to celebrate with friends tonight, but first we're going home. Grandma's setting the table. You're with us, right?" Christy looked back at her ex-husband in surprise. She was still afraid to cross the invisible line. Dan just nodded affirmatively. "Of course, with us. We now do everything together for the sake of the children." These simple words made Christy's eyes sting again. She surreptitiously wiped the corners so as not to embarrass her sons. "Thank you," she said quietly. Caleb put his arm around her shoulders. "Thank you, Mom, for coming and everything." She just smiled sadly, understanding the hidden meaning of these words well. In general, meant for returning to their lives. The day was drawing to a close. The graduates were leaving in all directions. Dan and his mother were already waiting by the car at the school porch. Caleb ran off to say goodbye to the teachers. Christy stood next to Jake a little further away. "Well, now you're next in line for graduation," she gently nudged her son with her elbow. He had 2 years of school left. Jake chuckled skeptically. "Wow, Mom, isn't it a bit early to plan?" She grinned. "I really want to be at your graduation too." The boy looked at her and suddenly, unexpectedly for her, took her hand. "Okay, I'll try not to disappoint you." He smiled with the corner of his mouth. Christy felt a lump of happiness in her throat. In that moment, she realized that life had given her a second chance. A chance she didn't deserve, but one she would fight for every day. Looking around at her family so close, a little older, but still close, she felt deep gratitude. There were difficulties ahead, work on relationships, slow forgiveness. But most importantly, now she had someone to live for and correct her mistakes. And they would overcome the rest. Together. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.